41 engineers sat in the main floor of Veltara Systems the morning they switched the system over. 41. Every one of them with a badge, a coffee, a chair that cost more than most men's monthly rent. And then there was Caleb Merritt, worn canvas jacket, scuffed work boots, a 7-year-old girl named Nora standing beside him, one hand inside his, the other wrapped around a small stuffed fox named Pip, orange, soft, one ear slightly bent from years of being held exactly the same way. The announcement had been made 3 minutes earlier. The AI platform was live. Caleb's role had been eliminated. And as he walked out through the glass doors into the gray Tuesday morning, nobody called after him. They didn't know what he had built inside that system. They didn't know what would happen when it met the real world without him. Stay with this one. It earns every minute. His name was Caleb Merritt, 31 years old. He had worked the data infrastructure floor at Veltara Systems for 4 years, not in a suit, not with a title anyone envied, but as the man who kept the pipelines running when everything else went sideways. His badge said Data Operations Technician. What it didn't say was that he had designed 70% of the logic architecture those pipelines ran on. It didn't say that his name appeared on a provisional patent filed 3 years earlier, before the merger, before the NDAs, before a man named Gareth Cole had quietly removed Caleb's name from the internal credit log and inserted his own. It didn't say any of that. It said Technician. And that is what the room saw when they looked at him. The morning of the announcement, Caleb had arrived at 6:43, same as always. He had dropped Nora at the before-school program at Elm Creek Elementary, watched her run in with Pip tucked under her arm, and driven the 12 minutes to Veltara in a car with a cracked dashboard vent he kept meaning to fix. He had poured his coffee, black, no lid, and sat at his workstation before the fluorescent lights had fully warmed up. He had noticed 3 days prior that his access credentials had been quietly shifted, read-only on 2 subsystems he used to write to daily. He had not mentioned it. He had noted it in a small black notebook he kept in his left jacket pocket and gone back to work. At 9:15, the all-staff message from CEO Mara Voss had arrived. Subject line, Veltara's next chapter, streamlined, smarter, built for scale. The body of the email had contained a great deal of language about efficiency and investment in the future. What it said beneath all of that was that the new AI operations platform, a system called Aeon, licensed from a third-party developer for a figure Caleb had heard quoted at $4.2 million, would be replacing the manual oversight roles in data infrastructure. Effective immediately. Severance packages had been prepared. HR would be in touch. Gareth Cole had been standing near the windows when the email went out. 51 years old. Gray at the temples. A watch that caught the light when he moved. The careful ease of a man who had never once doubted he belonged exactly where he was. He had looked at Caleb's workstation from across the room. He had not smiled. He had done something quieter than that. He had simply looked and then looked away. Caleb had read the email twice. He had closed his laptop. He had collected his notebook, the small framed photograph of Nora from his desk, and the half-full mug of coffee. He had not said anything to anyone. He had walked to the elevator, pressed the lobby button, and stood quietly while the floors descended. Not angry, not broken. Something older than either of those. He had called the school at 9:48. He told them he would be picking Nora up at the regular time. He told them she had a good morning. He drove home, and he sat at the kitchen table and he looked at the window for 7 minutes. There was a drawing on the refrigerator, a fox with an oversized tail labeled Pip in purple crayon, underneath which Nora had written, "My dad's friend too," with no apostrophe. Caleb looked at it for a long moment. Then he opened his notebook and began to write. He had met Mara Voss once in person, a company-wide event 14 months ago when she had just been appointed. She was 33. She had a background in product strategy, a master's from Northwestern, and a board that had made its skepticism about her age abundantly clear in the press. She was trying to prove something. Caleb had understood that from the moment he heard her speak. She was not cruel. She was under pressure from every direction, and Gareth Cole had been standing at her elbow for the better part of a year, feeding her the narrative she needed to believe. The narrative was this: the data infrastructure team was bloated, slow, and resistant to modernization. Aeon could handle it cleaner, faster, cheaper. The only reason Aeon hadn't been implemented sooner was legacy dependency. Old code, old logic, old thinking, personified in people like Caleb Merritt, who had been there too long and held the system back. That was the story Gareth had told. He had told it with charts. He had told it with an external consultant's report, a report that had, in fact, been partially authored by Gareth himself using information pulled from Caleb's own internal documentation, with Caleb's methodologies reframed as bottlenecks and his architecture described gently as outdated. Caleb had seen the report circulating 6 weeks before the announcement. He had read it on a Sunday afternoon with Nora asleep on the couch beside him, Pip wedged between her cheek and the armrest. He had read it carefully. He had closed it. He had not gone to HR. He had not gone to Mara Voss. He had gone to his notebook and written 3 lines, and then he had made grilled cheese and watched Nora wake up slowly, the way she always did, with her eyes opening halfway for a full minute before the rest of her followed. The 3 lines in the notebook were a list of every system behavior Aeon would not be able to replicate. Not because the AI wasn't sophisticated, because the logic it needed in order to work had never been documented anywhere except inside Caleb's own architecture that Gareth's reframing had quietly buried rather than handed over. Aeon went live on a Tuesday. By Thursday morning, Veltara's primary data pipeline had failed in 4 places simultaneously. The first failure happened at 6:19 in the morning. A routing conflict, the kind that looked minor on a dashboard but cascaded inside the system like a crack in a dam. Aeon flagged it, generated a resolution suggestion, and applied it. The suggestion was technically correct in isolation. It was catastrophically wrong in context because the pipeline it rerouted fed into a secondary authentication layer that had been hand-coded 4 years earlier to compensate for a vendor API quirk that no longer appeared in any documentation except the part Caleb had written and Gareth had buried. By 7:45, the authentication layer had begun rejecting valid user sessions. By 8:30, 3 of Veltara's largest enterprise clients could not access their dashboards. Mara Voss was in the building by 8:50. Gareth Cole was already there, standing at the head of the operations room, sleeves rolled, projecting the energy of a man managing a crisis. He was explaining in patient tones that this was a transitional adjustment period, that Aeon was self-correcting, that the system would stabilize. Aeon was not stabilizing. Aeon was doing exactly what it had been designed to do, optimize within the parameters it had been given. And the parameters it had been given were incomplete because the man who understood what was missing had been walked out of the building 48 hours ago. Madison Reyes had been Mara's assistant for 11 months. She was 26, quiet, and had the particular gift of people who sit in the same room as powerful conversations. She remembered everything. She had been the one to notice during the external consultant's presentation 6 weeks ago that the methodology section had language in it she'd read somewhere before. She had gone back through the internal documentation archive that evening. She had found the source. She had not said anything because she was 26 and Gareth Cole was Gareth Cole. But she had written it down. At 9:17, while Gareth was still explaining the situation to Mara in the operations room, Madison walked to Mara's office, knocked once, and placed a single sheet of paper on the desk. It was a comparison. 2 columns. On the left, a passage from the internal documentation Caleb had authored, time-stamped and signed with his employee credentials, dated 3 years prior. On the right, a passage from the external consultant's report, word for word identical in methodology, attributed to the consultant with no reference to any internal source. Madison did not say anything. She put the paper on the desk and walked back to her station. Mara looked at it for 45 seconds. Then she looked up at the doorway where Madison had been standing. Not anger, not panic, something quieter and harder than either. She picked up her phone. She called HR. She asked for Caleb Merritt's personal contact information. Caleb was at Elm Creek Elementary at 9:43 when his phone rang. He had walked Nora to the gate, watched her find her best friend Delia near the climbing structure, watched Nora hold Pip up so Delia could see him, a ritual they apparently performed every morning, and then stepped back to the sidewalk. He looked at the number. Veltara main line. He let it ring twice. Then he answered. The voice on the other end was Mara Voss. She did not begin with pleasantries. She said, "Mr. Merritt, we have a significant system failure, and I believe it may be connected to architectural dependencies that weren't captured in the transition documentation. I'd like to ask you to come in. Today." A pause. "I'd like to ask, not instruct. I understand if your answer is no." Caleb was quiet for 4 seconds. He said, "I'll need to arrange care for my daughter." Mara said she would cover whatever cost was involved. Caleb said that wasn't the point. He said he would be there by 11. He called his neighbor, Arthur Finch, 72, retired systems engineer, the man who had built model trains in his garage, and once, over 2 years of Saturday conversations through a chain-link fence, quietly recognized in Caleb something that most of Veltara's leadership had never bothered to look for. Arthur said he would pick Nora up at 3 and they would build something and that Caleb should bring coffee when he returned. Caleb said he would. He arrived at Veltara at 11:04. He did not have a badge. He was signed in at the lobby as a visitor. The woman at the desk, same woman who had been there for 4 years, who had always said good morning when he arrived, said good morning now, without the hesitation of someone who has been told to be awkward about it. He appreciated that. Gareth Cole was in the operations room when Caleb walked in. The expression on Gareth's face moved through 3 stages in approximately 1 second: surprise, containment, recovery. He said in a measured voice that he wasn't sure outside personnel should be interfacing with the live system. He said it to Mara, not to Caleb. Mara said, "He's not outside personnel. He's a consultant, and I'd like you to step back from the board, please." Gareth stepped back. Caleb stood at the operations console for a moment. He looked at the failure cascade on the screen the way a man looks at a thing he has seen coming from a long way off. He opened his notebook, the small black one, from his left jacket pocket, and he found the page he had written on the Sunday afternoon 6 weeks ago when Nora was asleep with Pip on the couch. He said, "The Aeon routing override hit the secondary auth layer at the Hendrix API junction. It's trying to resolve using the vendor's current documentation, but the junction was built on a workaround for a bug that was patched in their 2021 update. The workaround was never deprecated because removing it would break the session handoff for clients on legacy integration packages." The room was quiet. Not the quiet of nothing happening. The quiet of a room where everyone has just understood that the problem is both more serious and more solvable than they believed simultaneously. He said, "I can write a bypass parameter that lets Aeon route around the junction without dismantling it. It'll take about 40 minutes. The pipeline will restabilize within 2 hours of that." Mara said, "Teen, please." He sat down. He worked. He did not explain what he was doing in real time because people who know what they're doing rarely do. The room watched. Gareth Cole stood near the back wall and said nothing. At one point, a junior engineer named Priya leaned slightly toward her colleague and whispered something, and her colleague nodded. At 12:19, the primary pipeline resumed normal function. At 12:41, the enterprise client dashboards came back online. At 1:07, Aeon generated its first clean resolution suggestion of the day, because now it had the parameters it needed. Mara Voss sat down in the chair beside Caleb's workstation. Not across from him, beside him. She looked at the screen for a moment. She said, "I need to show you something." She placed Madison's comparison sheet on the desk. The 2 columns, the matching text. Caleb looked at it. He had read both documents before. He said nothing. Mara said, "The consultants report that justified the Aeon implementation. A significant portion of its methodology was taken directly from your internal documentation. Without credit, without permission. I believe Gareth Cole provided the material to the consultant and represented it as his own analysis." Caleb looked at the paper for a moment longer. Then he looked at the drawing in his mind, the one on his own refrigerator, the orange fox with the oversized tail, the misspelled caption. He thought about the provisional patent filing from 3 years ago, the one with his name removed. He reached into his jacket. He put his own notebook on the desk, open to a specific page, a page that showed in his own handwriting a cross-referenced list of every methodology in the consultant's report mapped back to the internal documentation he had authored, with dates. He had written it 6 weeks ago on the Sunday afternoon while Nora slept. He had been waiting to be asked. Mara looked at the notebook. She looked at it for a long moment. She said, "How long have you had this?" He said, "Like 6 weeks. She said, "Why didn't you bring it forward?" He said, "Because I wanted to see what would happen when the system ran without the parts it was missing." The room, the small number of people still in the room, went completely still. Gareth Cole had understood sometime in the previous 30 seconds what was happening. He had understood it the way a man understands a thing that has been true for a long time and has simply arrived in the open. He moved toward the door. He said something about another meeting. Mara said without raising her voice, "Gareth, please stay." He stayed. What followed was not a confrontation in the dramatic sense. It was quieter than that and worse. Mara went through the documentation methodically. She asked questions. Gareth answered some of them and said he didn't recall others. Madison was brought in. She brought 3 additional files she had flagged over the previous weeks, backup copies of the original documentation archive, time-stamped, showing access logs, showing when and by whom the credit attribution had been modified. Gareth Cole's name appeared in those logs. It appeared in places it should not have appeared. It appeared in the audit trail of a provisional patent that had, 3 years ago, been filed with one name and amended with another. At 3:45 in the afternoon, Gareth Cole was escorted from the building. Not loudly. Not with ceremony. 2 people from legal and 1 from HR, and the particular silence of a hallway that knows it is watching something permanent happen. Caleb was not in the hallway when this happened. He was at the operations console, reviewing Aeon's parameter set and writing a clean documentation pass that would allow the system to function without the gaps that had caused the cascade. He was doing this because the system needed it, and it was in front of him, and that was enough reason. Mara found him there at 4:20. She stood beside the console for a moment. She said, "We would like to offer you your position back, and we'd like to reclassify it, appropriately, with the title and compensation that should have accompanied the work you've been doing." Caleb was quiet. She said, "We would also like to formally acknowledge your authorship on the Aeon framework architecture and pursue correction of the patent record. Our legal team is prepared to act on that immediately." He said, "I'll think about it." She said she understood. She said there was no time pressure. She said whatever he decided, the patent correction and the formal acknowledgement would proceed regardless. He nodded. He closed his notebook. He put his jacket on. He said, "I need to go pick up my daughter." He was at Arthur's house by 5:10. Arthur opened the door before Caleb reached the porch. He had been watching from the front window, which was not something Arthur would have admitted. From behind, Arthur came the sound of 2 small feet on hardwood, and then Nora appeared at the door, still holding Pip. Bent ear, orange fur, one eye slightly shinier than the other from years of being looked at by someone who loved it. She said, "Daddy, we built a signal tower." He said, "Yeah?" She said, "It sends messages to foxes." He looked at her for a moment. He crouched down to her height. He said, "Does Pip know about it?" She considered this seriously. She said, "He helped design it." Arthur handed Caleb a coffee. They stood in the doorway while Nora explained the engineering of the signal tower in careful detail. At one point she said, with the absolute certainty of a 7-year-old who has thought about this, "Pip says things always work better when you don't rush them." Caleb looked at his daughter. He looked at the small stuffed fox tucked under her arm. He thought about 48 hours. He thought about a notebook and a Sunday afternoon and a drawing on a refrigerator and a pipeline that had needed its missing pieces given back to it. He said, "Pip's right." The next morning, Caleb called Mara Voss at 8:15. He said he would return. He had 3 conditions. First, his title would reflect his actual function. Second, the documentation architecture would be credited to him in full, internally and publicly. Third, his schedule would include a hard stop at 4:45 every day, without exception, because a girl named Nora was at school until 3, and the time between school and dinner was not negotiable. Mara said yes to all 3 without hesitation. He arrived at Veltara the following Monday at 6:43, same as always. He stopped in the lobby, signed in at the desk. The same woman, the same good morning, except this time she used his name, and there was something in her voice that hadn't been there when he was simply the man who kept the pipelines running. He took the elevator. He poured his coffee. He sat down at his workstation. The chair was the same chair. The work was the same work. He opened his notebook to a clean page and wrote the date at the top and then the first item on the day's list, and then he got to it, quietly, without performance, the way he had always done the things that mattered. On the refrigerator at home, between a permission slip for Nora's school field trip and a photograph of a woman with dark hair and a laugh that still moved through the house sometimes when the light came in a particular way, there was a new drawing. A fox standing next to a tall tower, and beside the fox, a small figure with a canvas jacket and a coffee cup. Underneath, in careful purple crayon, Nora had written, "My dad fixes things." No explanation, no elaboration. She had said it the way children say the truest things, without knowing they've said anything at all. Caleb stood at the kitchen counter the morning he went back, packing Nora's lunch, folding the paper bag down the way she liked 3 times exactly. She was at the table with Pip propped against the juice glass, conducting some kind of negotiation with her cereal. She said without looking up, "Dad." He said, "Yeah." She said, "Is your work fixed now?" He was quiet for a moment. He put the lunch bag in her backpack. He zipped it. He said, "Getting there." She nodded, satisfied. She picked up her spoon. He picked up his coffee. He looked out the window at the gray Tuesday morning coming in slow over the rooftops, the same color as the morning 48 hours ago when he had walked out through those glass doors with nothing but a notebook and a photograph and the particular steadiness of a man who has never once confused being overlooked with being wrong. He did not look back. He picked up Nora's backpack. He waited for her to finish her cereal. He held the door. They walked out together, her hand in his, Pip under her arm, bent ear, orange fur, one eye slightly shinier than the other. The signal tower, Arthur had told him, was still standing in the back room.